a microbiologist here at Cardiff Met. And this morning when I was tidying up my desk and putting some of the papers away, I got a pretty nasty paper cut on my finger. It really stung, got a plaster on it. But aside from that, I'm not particularly worried because I have an expectation that it's going to go better, probably by tomorrow. It's not going to be a problem. But for a lot of people, that's not the case. And when they get an injury, it won't heal up and it becomes what we describe as chronic. And in fact, there's about 2.8 million people in the UK at the moment who have a wound that won't heal. They have chronic wounds. And those wounds won't heal for maybe months or years of their lives. And that's a really high number. And believe it or not, it's on a par with the number of people who have cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. But it's something that's really massively overlooked. But that's not to say that you should panic. So next time you get a paper cut, you're not going to end up with a chronic wound because by and large, people that get these non-healing wounds have some sort of underlying medical condition that means the wound won't heal. But that does mean that they've got an open wound on a part of their body, and it's incredibly difficult to stop stuff getting into an open wound, including microorganisms that can cause infectious diseases. And infections in chronic wounds are exceptionally difficult to get rid of. And this is in spite of the fact that we have got loads of options for treating chronic wound infections. And they're really well-known options, and they're really potent antimicrobials, things like iodine and honey and silver that we know work in the lab. We know they kill bacteria. But for some reason, when we put them in a chronic wound, they seem to fail and they won't heal that infection. They won't kill the bacteria. And they're sort of failing to the tune of £5 billion a year for the NHS. That's how much it costs to manage chronic wound infections. And so we have to sort of ask ourselves why. Why are these really good antimicrobials not doing the job when we have them in the clinic? And to answer that question, we've got to consider how do we grow bacteria in the lab? How do I grow bacteria in the lab? So when I am culturing organisms, I go into the lab, I choose myself a nice piece of glassware, much like this lovely Erlenmeyer flask. I fill it full of a nutritious soup that the bacteria really love to eat. Swirl it around quite vigorously to aerate them, heat them up to 37, their favourite temperature, and they grow really, really well. And if I want to test an antimicrobial, I just take my bottle of antimicrobial, tip it into the culture, keep it swirling, keep it warm, and at the end of the experiment, I count up how many bacteria are dead, how many are alive. And if they're all dead, then great, we've got a new antimicrobial, we can send it to the clinic, where invariably it will not work. So what's going on? And so this reminds me of a conversation I had with one of my PhD students a few years ago. And he'd formulated a new antimicrobial. We were testing it in the lab, and he was really excited because it was working really, really well. And so I asked him if he thought it would work in a real chronic wound, to which he said, yeah, of course it would. Why wouldn't it? So I sort of pointed out the obvious to him, and I said that well, this glass flask you're using is very, very different to a real chronic wound. And he agreed. And we sat down and we thought, well, how do we make this glass flask more like a chronic wound? So we started to sort of have a bit of a discussion about, well, what's a chronic wound look like from the perspective of a bacteria? What's there that it wants? And we thought, okay, so a bacteria in a wound, it's growing on flesh. So we need some sort of solid, squashy substance that these bacteria can grow on. So not this soup that we have swirling around in a flask. And then we thought, well, what are we feeding them? So this is very much like Marmite, all of the nutrients in here, but that's not what a bacteria has to eat, essentially, when it's growing in a chronic wound. So we thought about what recipe do we need that's more like plasma, more like blood. And then we thought, well, what's it like? You know, we have these flasks in the lab swirling around really quite vigorously. A wound isn't like that. It's much more static. So we started to think, well, what do we need? What environmental factors will simulate a wound? And then we looked around the lab and we realized there was absolutely nothing that sort of fit that bill that we could build and put together to achieve that. And so at that point, we sat down, we put pen to paper, and we came up with a few different designs that tried to incorporate this microbial perspective. And we came up with a new bit of lab equipment thanks to some 3D printing. And so this is what we came up with. I will pass it around so you can have a look. And you might be thinking, well, this is essentially, it's an oblong of plastic, so how is this more like a chronic wound than a glass flask? And I will explain to you how. So we designed it to have 12 holes, and in those holes we put a gel which resembles flesh, and we let the bacteria grow on that. We've got 4 channels running underneath it, so we feed the bacteria like an artificial wound fluid, which is a recipe that we came up with, so that they have the same nutrients that they have in a wound. And we designed it crucially, so you can put a wound dressing on top of it, so you're actually applying the antimicrobial like you would on a real wound. And it was quite exciting when we had a look at what the bacteria were doing in this model. We used electron microscopy, and we found that the bacteria looked and they behaved in our model exactly like you see them behaving in a real wound. It was comparable to a wound biopsy, which was pretty exciting and said to us that we'd got something right when we're trying to model a real wound. And so then we sort of really put it to the test. We put loads of different antimicrobial dressings on to see what would happen. And interestingly, what we saw is that none of them worked very well. And that might sound like our model has failed maybe, but it hadn't, because what we were seeing in those antimicrobials failing in our model is exactly what you see in the clinic. And so that really highlighted for us the importance of being able to develop and test antimicrobials in something that's very lifelike or resembles human far better than a glass flask, if we're going to stand any chance at all of getting those antimicrobials out of our lab and into the clinic and working successfully to reduce chronic wound infection. So I guess it's a tale of how microbiologists became designers, and we had a lot of fun and really hope that this little model can go some way to helping solve some of the problems of chronic wounds.